My brother slammed his fist on the attorney's table the day they read our father's will. He said I owed him half the auto body shop because I just pushed papers while he turned wrenches for 20 years. He called me a parasite, said I never got my hands dirty. What my brother didn't know was that 6 months before Dad died, I'd already bought the building, not the business. The building through a holding company I'd set up when his gambling debt started showing up in the county records. I'm Dominic Bassett, I'm 44, and I've been a commercial lease broker in Raleigh for 19 years. My brother thought he understood our father's shop. He didn't even understand who owned the floor he was standing on. My name is Dominic Paul Bassett. I live in a 2-story brick colonial off Falls of Noose Road in North Raleigh, about 4 miles from the office where I have brokered commercial leases since 2007. I handle strip malls, flex industrial spaces, medical office parks, automotive service bays. If there is a building with a tenant and a landlord and a triple net lease between them, I have probably touched the paperwork at some point. I know what a cap rate means. I know the difference between a gross lease and a modified gross. I know how to read an estoppel certificate, the way a mechanic reads a diagnostic screen. Buried clauses, mismatched numbers, paragraph 14 disclaimers that nobody was supposed to notice. I notice, if this is your first time here, take a moment to hit like and subscribe and drop your city and the time where you are in the comments. I read every single one. I want to tell you about my father, because without understanding who he was, nothing else in this story makes sense. Sal Bassett opened Bassett Collision and Paint on Hillsborough Street in 1986. He was 31 years old. He had $4,000 in savings, a small business administration loan for $65,000, and a 10-year lease on a 4-bay garage and a commercial strip between a tire shop and a transmission place. The building belonged to a man named Gus Hendricks, who owned about a dozen commercial properties across Wake County. Gus was 70, semi-retired, and charged below-market rents because he liked tenants who showed up on time and didn't call him on Sundays. Dad paid $900 a month for 2,200 square feet plus the 4 bays. No escalation clause, no percentage rent, just flat $900 a month. Handshake terms written into a lease so short you could read it during a commercial break. That lease was the foundation of everything. $900 a month for 2,200 square feet on Hillsborough Street. In 1986, that was a fair deal. By 1996, it was a bargain. By 2006, it was almost criminal. Commercial rents on Hillsborough had climbed past $14 a square foot. Dad was paying less than $5. That gap between what he paid and what the space was worth, that was the invisible engine underneath the whole business. Low rent meant low overhead. Low overhead meant Dad could undercut every other body shop in Wake County on labor rates and still clear a profit. Customers thought Dad was just a good mechanic who charged fair prices. He was, but the real advantage was the lease. I understood that before I was old enough to drive. I used to sit in the office after school doing homework at the metal desk while Dad worked the bays. I watched him file invoices, write estimates, call insurance adjusters. I watched him negotiate with parts suppliers and argue about paint matching with the guy from the Sherwin-Williams Automotive Division. By the time I was 15, I could read a repair estimate and tell you whether the labor hours were padded. By 16, I was doing the shop's quarterly taxes on a calculator and a legal pad. My brother Vincent was 3 years older. He was in the bays. He started sweeping floors at 13, moved to sanding and taping at 15, was spraying clear coat by 17. Vincent was good with his hands, strong, precise, patient in the way that bodywork demands. He could pull a dent from a quarter panel with a slide hammer and leave the surface so clean you'd think the car had never been hit. Dad was proud of him. I was proud of him too. But Vincent had a different relationship with money than I did. I saw $1 and thought about where it could go. Vincent saw $1 and spent it. He bought a Camaro at 19 with money he hadn't finished earning yet. He ran up credit cards in his early 20s. He discovered poker in his mid-20s and blackjack in his late 20s. By 30, he had a rhythm I recognized from studying commercial tenant financials. Income in, obligations out, gap widening, float getting shorter, each month tighter than the last. I had seen that pattern in 100 businesses. I had never expected to see it in my own brother. Dad knew. He didn't talk about it directly, but he knew. He covered Vincent's rent twice in 2014. He paid off a credit card balance of $11,000 in 2016. He co-signed a truck loan in 2017 that Vincent stopped making payments on within 4 months. Each time, Dad told me about it over the phone in that careful voice he used when he was trying not to sound worried. I would just listen. I didn't lecture. That was not my place. But I was keeping a mental ledger. The way you keep one when you're watching a tenant's financial slide and you know the lease renewal conversation is going to be difficult. Gus Hendricks died in 2009. His son, Terry, inherited the properties and promptly hired a management company to run them. The management company raised rents across the portfolio. Dad's lease was grandfathered at $900, but Terry's people sent notices to every tenant explaining that renewals would be at market rate. Dad's lease ran through 2011. After that, the $900 rent was gone. I handled the renewal negotiation myself. I was 29, 3 years into my career as a commercial lease broker, and I knew exactly how these conversations worked. I pulled comps for every automotive use property on Hillsborough and the surrounding corridors. I ran the numbers on tenant improvement costs, build-out amortization, vacancy rates for specialty use spaces. Automotive bays are hard to retenant. The environmental requirements alone, the oil-water separators, the ventilation systems, the fire suppression upgrades make most landlords prefer to keep an existing auto tenant rather than gut the space for a yoga studio. I used that leverage. I negotiated Dad a 7-year lease at $12 a square foot with 2% annual escalations and a right of first refusal on the adjacent suite. The deal saved him about $40,000 over the lease term compared to what Terry's management company had initially proposed. Dad signed it on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't say thank you in words, but he took me to dinner at the Italian place on Glenwood Avenue and ordered a bottle of wine, which was something Sal Bassett did about twice a decade. That was 2011. The second renewal came in 2018. By then, I was a senior broker at my firm, handling portfolios worth north of $60 million in annual lease value. I had negotiated deals in the Research Triangle Park, in downtown Durham, in the warehouse districts along Capitol Boulevard. I knew what buildings were worth because I spent every working day calculating it. And I knew what the Hillsborough Street building was worth because I'd been tracking its assessed value, its rental comps, and its cap rate since 2009. The building, all 5 units, including Dad's 4 bays and the adjacent suite, was worth somewhere around $780,000 based on trailing 12-month income and a 6.5 cap rate. Terry Hendricks didn't know I was tracking it. Nobody did. It was just something I did, the way a mechanic keeps an eye on an engine even when it's running fine. You watch the gauges because the gauges tell you what's coming before it arrives. The second thing I was watching was Vincent's gambling. In 2017, a lien appeared in the Wake County records against Vincent's personal property. $8,000 filed by a company called Atlantic Entertainment LLC, which I traced to an offshore sports betting operation based in Curacao. The lien was satisfied 60 days later. Dad's bank records showed a withdrawal of $8,200 on the same date. In 2018, a second lien. This one was $14,000. Same type of company, different name. Dad paid it again. I sat in my office on a Wednesday evening in February 2019 and ran the numbers. Over the previous 5 years, Dad had given or lent Vincent approximately $91,000. Rent payments, credit card payoffs, truck payments, gambling liens. $91,000 from a man who ran a 4-bay body shop and took home about $75,000 a year after expenses. That was more than a year's income, gone into Vincent's debts like water into a cracked foundation. And Vincent never once acknowledged it. He never said thank you to Dad, at least not that I heard. He treated the money the way some tenants treat a landlord's goodwill, as something owed, as something that would always be there. He showed up at the shop, turned wrenches, sprayed paint, and went home. He did good work, nobody disputes that. But he seemed to believe that showing up and working was the entirety of his contribution, and that everything else, the lease, the insurance, the equipment financing, the quarterly taxes, the relationship with the insurance adjusters, the bookkeeping, the vendor negotiations, all the invisible infrastructure that kept the shop alive, that all of that just happened on its own. In June 2019, Dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Stage 3. The oncologist in Raleigh laid it out plainly. Treatment might buy time, but the prognosis was difficult. Dad listened, asked 2 questions, nodded, and drove himself back to the shop. He finished a bumper repair that afternoon. He did not tell Vincent about the diagnosis for 3 weeks. He told me the same day on the phone while I was sitting in my car in a parking deck on Fayetteville Street after a lease closing. He said it the way he said everything. Straight, no padding. I sat in the car for a long time after we hung up. The next morning, I called my attorney. Not a real estate attorney, an asset protection attorney, a woman named Carol Henning who had handled trust and entity structures for 3 of my larger clients. I told her I needed to form a holding company, single-member LLC registered in North Carolina with a name that would not connect to me or my family. She set it up within a week. The company was called Piedmont Bay Holdings LLC. I was the sole member. The registered agent was Carol's office address on St. Mary Street. Then I called Terry Hendricks. I told him I represented a buyer who was interested in acquiring several of his commercial properties in the Hillsborough corridor. Terry was 63 by then. His wife had been asking him to retire for years. His management company took 15% off the top and did mediocre work. He was tired. I knew he was tired because I had watched his maintenance response times deteriorate for 2 years. When a landlord stops fixing things promptly, it means one of 2 things. Either he's broke or he's done. Terry wasn't broke. We negotiated for 5 weeks. I offered $720,000 for the building, which included all 5 units. Terry countered at $760. We settled at $742,000 with closing costs split and Dad's existing lease assigned to the new ownership entity. The sale closed on October 8, 2019. Piedmont Bay Holdings LLC became the legal owner of the building where my father had worked for 33 years. The deed was recorded in Wake County on October 10th. I paid cash from a combination of my savings, a HELOC on my Raleigh house, and a small commercial credit facility secured against my brokerage commissions. No bank loan on the property itself. Clean title, no encumbrances, no mortgage to service. Dad didn't know. I did not tell him because I did not want him to feel managed. He was a proud man. If I had told him I'd bought his building, he would have seen it as pity. I was not doing it out of pity. I was doing it because I had watched Vincent's gambling debts climb for 5 years, and I had watched Dad drain his savings to cover them. And I knew with the certainty of someone who has structured 1,000 lease deals that when Dad died, Vincent would try to take whatever was left. Not out of malice, out of need. A gambler's debts don't pause for grief, they accelerate. I structured the holding company to own only the building. Dad's business, Bassett Collision and Paint, remained his. The equipment, the accounts receivable, the client list, the insurance relationships, the DBA, all of that stayed in Dad's name. But the building, the 4 walls, and the roof and the concrete floor, and the parking lot and the signage rights and the land underneath, that belonged to Piedmont Bay Holdings. That belonged to me. If you're finding value in this story, hit subscribe. I share stories like this every week, and I think you'll find the rest of this one worth staying for. Dad died on April 14, 2020, a Tuesday. He worked his last full day at the shop 11 days before that, on a Friday. He finished a quarter panel replacement on a 2017 Honda Civic and filed the invoice before he locked up. He was 65 years old. I was with him in the hospice room on Oberlin Road when it ended. Vincent arrived 20 minutes after. He stood in the doorway, looked at Dad, looked at me, and walked back to the parking lot. I found him leaning against his truck with his hands on his knees. I did not comfort him. I did not know how. Vincent and I were both named in the will. Dad left the business to both of us equally, 50-50. The house went to our mother, Gina, who had been living separately from Dad since 2015 but had never formally divorced. Personal effects were divided. There was a savings account with $41,000 in it, which was split between us. And there was the shop. The will reading was at an attorney's office on Six Forks Road. Second floor conference room with a long walnut table and a window overlooking the parking lot. Mom was there. Vincent was there. Vincent's girlfriend, a woman named Keely, waited in the lobby. The attorney, a man named Bill Falconer, read the document straight through. When he finished, Vincent leaned forward. He looked at me and said, "So we split the shop 50-50. Bill said that was correct. The business and all its assets would be divided equally. Vincent nodded. Then he said, "You just pushed papers while I did the real work." He said it like he'd been waiting to say it, like he'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. He looked at Bill when he said it, then back at me. 20 years I've been in that shop. 20 years turning wrenches, pulling dents, matching paint. What did Dom do? He sat in an air-conditioned office and shuffled lease agreements? He's a parasite. Mom looked at the table. Bill shifted in his chair. I did not respond. I sat very still and let Vincent finish. He wasn't done. He said he deserved more than half. He said the business wouldn't exist without his labor. He said I had contributed nothing. He said Dad would have agreed. He said he wanted me to sign over my half immediately, or he would contest the will on the grounds that I had exercised undue influence over Dad in his final months. Undue influence. He used those words. I remember thinking he must have looked them up. I waited until the room was quiet. Then I said one sentence. I said, "Vincent, the business is yours. Take all of it." He blinked. Mom looked up. Bill looked at me. I said it again. "The business is yours. 100%. I don't want it." Vincent's mouth opened slightly. He looked at Keely through the glass door to the lobby. Then back at me. He said, "You serious?" I said, "Yes." I said the business, all of it, the equipment, the client list, the insurance contracts, the DBA, the receivables, everything that constituted Bassett Collision and Paint was his. I would sign whatever release Bill needed me to sign. I wanted nothing from the operating business. Vincent almost smiled. He caught himself, but I saw it. That flicker of disbelief that turns into satisfaction when someone hands you something you expected to fight for. Bill drew up a release agreement that afternoon. I signed it. Vincent signed it. The operating business of Bassett Collision and Paint became 100% Vincent's. He shook Bill's hand. He did not shake mine. I drove home. I sat in my office. I opened my laptop and drafted a letter on Piedmont Bay Holdings letterhead. The letter was addressed to the tenant of 420 Hillsborough Street, Suite B, Raleigh, North Carolina. The letter informed the tenant that the property had been acquired by a new ownership entity, that all existing lease terms would be honored through the end of the current lease period, and that upon expiration, the lease would be renewed at current market rates. The current lease expired in 8 months. I had structured the 2018 renewal with an intentionally shorter term than usual, 3 years instead of 5, because I had already been thinking about what would happen when Dad was gone. A shorter lease meant a sooner renegotiation. A sooner renegotiation meant leverage. The market rate for automotive use commercial space on Hillsborough Street in 2020 was $19 a square foot for a comparable bay setup. Dad had been paying $14 based on the 2018 renewal I had negotiated for him. The gap between 14 and 19 applied across 2,200 square feet came to about $13,200 a year. That was the annual cost of Vincent running the shop without the lease advantage I had built for Dad over the previous decade. $13,200 a year that he had never thought about, never factored into his understanding of the business, and never once thanked anyone for. Vincent received the letter 3 weeks after the will reading. He called me that evening. His voice was the voice of a man who has just been told the rules of a game he thought he understood. He said, "What is Piedmont Bay Holdings?" I said it was the company that owned his building. He said, "What do you mean his building?" I said, "The building where Bassett Collision and Paint operates. 4 walls, a roof, a parking lot, 4 bays. The building was sold by the previous owner in October of last year. It is now owned by Piedmont Bay Holdings, LLC. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Who owns Piedmont Bay?" I said, "I do." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. I counted. Then he said, "You bought the building?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When?" I said, 6 months before Dad died. He said, "Does Mom know?" I said, "No." He said, "Did Dad know?" I said, "No." He said, "You're going to raise my rent." I said, "I'm going to set your rent at market rate when the current lease expires, which is what any landlord would do." "I'm not raising your rent, Vincent. I'm not giving you a discount. There's a difference." He hung up. Over the following 4 months, I watched from a distance. I did not interfere with the business. I did not visit the shop. I did not call Vincent. I simply waited for the lease expiration. The way you wait for a balloon payment to come due on a commercial note. The date is on the calendar. The math is already done. The only question is whether the borrower has been paying attention. Vincent had not been paying attention. He ran the shop the same way he always had. Good work, steady customers, fair prices. But without Dad managing the overhead, the margins started to slip. Vincent hired a part-time bookkeeper who lasted 2 months before quitting over unpaid invoices. He missed a quarterly tax filing. He ordered parts on credit from a supplier who charged 22% interest on balances over 60 days. The small things that Dad had managed quietly, the invisible infrastructure I mentioned earlier, started to break down the way a building breaks down when nobody checks the gauges. In December 2020, the lease expired. I sent a renewal offer through my attorney. The new terms were $19 a square foot, current market rate on a 5-year lease with 3% annual escalations and a personal guarantee from the tenant. Standard commercial terms, nothing predatory, nothing unusual. Exactly what any landlord in the Hillsborough corridor would have offered. Vincent called me. He said he couldn't afford it. I said I understood. I said the terms were non-negotiable, but I was willing to offer a 60-day grace period before the new rate took effect, which was more courtesy than most commercial landlords extend. He said, "You're doing this on purpose." I said, "I'm managing a commercial property." He said, "You're punishing me." I said, "Vincent, I'm offering you a market rate lease on a commercial property that I own. If you can show me that $19 a square foot is above market for automotive use space in this corridor, I will adjust. Pull the comps, show me the data, I will listen." He didn't pull the comps. He didn't have the first idea how to pull comps. He'd never thought about rent as a variable, because Dad had always handled it. And before Dad, I had handled it for Dad. The lease, the one invisible structure that held the entire business together, was a concept Vincent had never once engaged with. He signed the new lease in February 2021. He didn't have a choice. Moving a body shop is not like moving an office. The equipment is bolted down. The paint booth ventilation is built into the walls. The environmental permits are tied to the address. Walking away would have cost him more than staying. That first year under the new lease, his rent went from roughly $30,000 a year to about $42,000. $12,000 more every year, going to Piedmont Bay Holdings, going to me. He called our mother in March, told her what I had done. She called me the next day, voice shaking. She said, "Dominic, how could you do this to your brother?" I said, "Mom, how much did Dad spend covering Vincent's gambling debts?" She went quiet. She knew the number. She had watched it happen the same way I had, from a distance, hoping it would stop. I said, "I bought that building because I knew Vincent would bleed the business dry the same way he bled Dad. The building is the only thing worth protecting, and I protected it. I didn't take anything from Vincent. I gave him the entire business. Every tool, every client, every dollar of receivable. He has the business. I have the building. And the building is generating income that I am putting into an account for you, in case you need it later." She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Your father would have complicated feelings about this." I said, "I know." Vincent ran the shop for 2 more years under the new lease. He managed. The work was steady. He stopped gambling in 2022 after Keeley gave him an ultimatum. I know this because our cousin Teresa told me at a family dinner I was not invited to, but heard about the following week. He got a financial advisor, a man at a local firm who helped him restructure his debts and build a repayment plan. I was glad to hear it. I had not done any of this to destroy Vincent. I had done it to make sure he couldn't destroy what Dad built. In 2023, I offered Vincent a lease modification. I reduced his rate to $16 a square foot, below market, with the condition that he maintain a reserve fund equal to 3 months' operating expenses. He accepted. His rent dropped by about $6,000 a year. The reserve requirement forced him to save. I structured it the same way I would structure a lease concession for any tenant I wanted to keep. Reasonable terms, mutual benefit, documented in writing. We don't talk much. Holidays, sometimes, a text on birthdays. The silence between us has the weight of a load-bearing wall that neither of us is willing to tear down because we both know what it's holding up. The shop is still there. 4120 Hillsborough Street, same sign Dad put up in 1986. White letters on a blue background, slightly faded now. Vincent opens the bays every morning at 7:30. He's gotten better at the bookkeeping. He hired a part-time office manager last year, a woman named Donna who used to work for a dealership in Cary. The quarterly taxes are filed on time. I drive past the building about once a month. I don't stop. I just look at it the way a broker looks at any property in his portfolio, checking the condition of the roof, the state of the parking lot, whether the signage complies with the municipal code. And sometimes I think about Dad, standing in Bay 2 with a sanding block in his hand and the radio tuned to WRAL, working on a quarter panel, the way he worked on everything. Carefully, completely, without needing anyone to notice. He built the business. I built the lease structure underneath it. Vincent built the cars. Each of us worked with our hands in our own way. The difference is that Vincent never understood what he was standing on. He thought the floor was solid because it had always been solid. He never asked who poured the foundation. If you like this story, there are more like it on the channel. I'll see you in the next one.